Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Jean-Frederic Colombel, a distinguished researcher in inflammatory bowel diseases. Dr. Colombel completed his medical degree and gastroenterology training in France. He worked at the University of Lille for over 2 decades, where he was a professor of hepatogastroenterology and eventually head of the Department of Gastroenterology. Since 1984, Dr. Colombel's research has focused on IBD, and his work has contributed immensely to our understanding of the pathophysiology of these diseases. Among other achievements, he is well known for his participation in the identification of NOD2 as a susceptibility gene for Crohn's disease, the identification of a new subtype of E. coli associated with Crohn's disease, and the development of the anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody test, which remains the most sensitive and specific marker for Crohn's disease. He has also been involved in many of the clinical trials of the last 20 years that have helped to develop new drugs and improve therapeutic strategies in IBD. Since 2013, Dr. Colombel has directed the Feinstein IBD Center here at Mount Sinai, where he has coordinated research efforts across disciplines, industries, and international lines. He has served as the president of the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization and the chair of the International Organization of Inflammatory Bowel Diseases. Dr. Colombel has published extensively and been the recipient of multiple awards. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Colombel.
Thank you, and good morning. So I've been in New York, Mount Sinai, for almost 7 years now, and you will notice that I have still this very strong French accent. I apologize for that. During this talk, I would like to give a kind of overview of what I have seen during those 40 years of IBD care. First in Lille, which is in northern France, where I've been for almost 30 years, and at Mount Sinai. I would like to describe the progresses that we have made. I would like also to show you some disappointments that we had, and maybe to describe what could be the way forward. So let's start with the past, and let's consider what we have achieved during those years. The first thing that you need to remember is that not so long ago, IBD was a cause of death. And for instance, in this paper by Sidney Trulov in the 50s, among more than 100 cases of severe ulcerative colitis admitted in Oxford, there was a huge mortality, 22%, which is now reduced to less than 1%. And actually, I was very happy when this population-based study from Denmark was published in 2007, showing basically that there was no difference in observed and expected survival of patients with UC. But unfortunately, the most recent news are not that good. First, we have certainly made progresses in reducing the cause of death linked to colorectal cancer. And as you can see, the colorectal cancer percent here is now at 10 years, very, very small, much smaller than in the past. So this is a progress. But this is a recent paper coming from Sweden, which I think it's worrying, because it's showing that when you start your disease in very early age, then the mortality is still increased. And it's still threefold. And this was by matching the childhood onset IBD and the general population. So kids who got IBD very early have still an increased risk of death. And very recently, also coming from Sweden, where they have these very nice population-based registries, they published this data showing that incident cases, adult onset, between 2002 and 2014, still had 2.3 years shorter mean estimated lifespan than matched comparators. So in 2019, we are still, some patients are still dying from IBD. Of course, we had made progresses, but I think this is not enough. On the top of that, even though we have made progresses regarding medications, as you know, some medications are associated with risk of deadly disease. And there was especially a big concern about the risk of lymphoma in IBD induced by immunomodulators such as thiopurine and biologics such as anti-TNF. This is a big study coming from France, a national-wide French cohort, showing the hazard ratio of death for all lymphoma in patients treated with thiopurine monotherapy, anti-TNF like infliximab monotherapy, and combination therapy. And as you can see, even when you are exposed to mono with azathioprine or anti-TNF, you have an increased risk of lymphoma and sometimes death. But this risk is certainly strongly increased when using combination therapy, which is the most effective. So the progresses that we have made as far as treatment at some price. The second goal that we have achieved, and this was not so easy, was to get symptomatic remission. And clinical remission has been the main endpoint for many pivotal clinical trials. And I think it's quite nice to see all these pivotal clinical trials with new medications in IBD. So the anti-TNF family, the new P40 anti-IL-12, IL-23 family, vedolizumab and anti-integrin treatment, and more recently the oral JAK inhibitors. So we have obviously made progresses. And now in the clinic, we have access to many drugs. And what is not so easy, actually, is to position this drug. What drug should we be using first? But what has been very important is that we are able not only to induce remission, but to sustain clinical remission. Once remission has been achieved, this is data with adalimumab in Crohn's disease. As you can see, we can get this sustained clinical remission over more than 3 years in most of our patients. So this is good. But, and I'm always like the white and black face of the picture, we are plateauing. When you are considering what is the absolute success rate of all these biologics, it's not that high. Because remember that in all those pivotal trials, we are randomizing patients with active disease for induction, and then the responder to induction are randomized for the maintenance phase. But if you go back to the original sample size of 100, what's the percentage of patients who are actually in remission among those 100? And as you can see, it's not that high with the anti-TNF or with the vedolizumab or ustekinumab. So progresses certainly, but still huge gap. So we need to improve those results. Something else that to me is worrying is that as soon as you have put one patient on a biologics, the chance that he will respond to a second biologic if he's failing is lower. I'm not sure that we perfectly understand that. Maybe just a marker of disease severity. Maybe we are changing something in the mucosal immune system of the patients, which is making him more refractory to a second biologics. This is a meta-analysis of clinical trials looking at induction of clinical remission in ulcerative colitis patients with previous exposure to anti-TNF. And as you can see, if you have been exposed, for instance, to one anti-TNF, the chance that you will respond to a second anti-TNF, here adalimumab, is not better than placebo. Same is true for a second class, a completely different class of drug like vedolizumab. And only tofacitinib is better than the placebo in this circumstance. And in the clinic, and all of my friends here know that, in the clinic we are seeing more and more patients who have been exposed to one biologics, two biologics, three biologics, and are basically becoming refractory to everything. And I'm not sure we perfectly understand what's the mechanisms behind that. Then we went even further from clinical remission to what we have called deep remission. What is deep remission? Deep remission basically is going deeper into the iceberg. In the past, we were targeting symptoms, but we were thinking maybe we can do better. Maybe we can target inflammation at the mucosal level, meaning endoscopic. Maybe at the transmural level, by looking at CT scan or MRI. Maybe histology, or even at the molecular level. Because we believe that if we are able to go deeper into the iceberg, not only we will be able to stop the symptoms, but we'll be able to stop the progression of the disease. And this is what we have been able to achieve. This is maybe the most important paper to me that has been published in the last 50 years. It's a case report published by Sander van Deventer on the right-hand side, published in 1995. This paper made the cover of our pivotal journal, which is Gastroenterology, and it was a shock for all of us because it showed for the first time that in Crohn's disease, not only with a medication, in that case it was an anti-TNF, you are able to treat the symptoms, but you are able to heal the mucosa. To me, this was a revolution in the treatment of IBD, and this was in 1995. I must acknowledge that my mentors, one obviously retired, Robert Modigliani, one who is not retired, Jean-Yves Marie, who is my statistician, were already thinking about the importance of endoscopy in 1989 because they created an endoscopic index of severity. So this switch from clinical remission to deep remission, including clinical plus endoscopic remission, has been a big achievement in the treatment of IBD, both in Crohn and ulcerative colitis. And this is what we can achieve. This is, for instance, the recent data from a study that we did in early patients, very new patients, median disease duration 1 year, all treated with adalimumab with a different approach, one escalating drugs based on biomarker, one escalating drugs based on symptoms. The point that I want to make is that using this very early intervention with adalimumab and using this strategy of escalation based on biomarker, we are able to achieve endoscopic remission. This is a definition based on the endoscopic index in 46% of patients, and deep remission, meaning clinical and endoscopic, in 37%. This is beautiful. This is why I put this. But it's not that good. These are the best patients. These are the earliest patients. Some basically treated at diagnosis with an anti-TNF. And this is so far the best that we can achieve. So we need to find, again, something else. Bruce has done this beautiful head-to-head study that he will publish soon, comparing adalimumab and vedolizumab in the treatment of ulcerative colitis. The point that I want to make is that for the first time, he looked at another endpoint even deeper in the iceberg, which shows histological remission. And using these two histological index, he was able to show that both with adalimumab and vedolizumab, he was able to induce histological remission. So again, this is nice, but it's only 37%. So again, those patients were naive. So it's a progress, but there is still this gap. And even further, this is another paper, other study by Bruce that he will soon publish as well. He created this new concept of mucosal healing, which is combination of endoscopic and histological healing, again, deeper and deeper into the iceberg. And he was able to show that using this medication, which is ustekinumab, which is an anti-IL-12, IL-23, he was able, with two different doses of the drug, to induce mucosal healing more than placebo. This was highly statistically significant. But look, only 20% of patients were able to achieve this endpoint. So it's feasible, but how can we fill this gap of 80%? And the question is that you may ask me, okay, it's fine to induce clinical remission, deep remission, and so on, but, and this is my original question, does that matter for patient life? Are we able to change the natural history of the disease? This is a slide that I created with my late friend Mark Lehman, illustrating the new concept of IBD. In the past, we are seeing IBD as an intermittent disease with flares and remission, and we were concentrating on treating symptoms, missing the point that rheumatologists know for many, many years, that all these immune-mediated diseases are progressing. And you are accumulating, as soon as you have a flare, damage caused to the gut by inflammation. And the damage is progressing a long time. So, for instance, in Crohn's disease, you are progressing from inflammation to stricture, other complication, fistula, and then the ultimate damage, which is surgery. So in the past, we had inflammatory measurements, and now we are creating new indices to measure the bowel damage. And this is a complete new concept of the treatment of IBD that I think is a new paradigm now. So this is good because it's showing, this is a meta-analysis, showing that risk of surgery for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis have been decreasing over the past 5 decades. So not only we are able to induce deep remission, but obviously we believe that this is translated in something which is key for the patient, less risk of surgery. So this is nice. And this is a kind of temporal trend in the need for surgery in Crohn's disease population-based study from various countries. And as you can see, starting with the biologic era, the 5-year surgery rate has started to decrease. But it's certainly still not zero. It's not zero because I believe that we are using those biologics too late. This is a follow-up study of the CALM study that I alluded to earlier. In that study, we took patients at diagnosis and we treated them very intensively with biologics. And then we look at what happened to those patients when we were able to induce deep remission at 1 year with these biologics, which was adalimumab. And you can see that those patients in red were able to achieve deep remission at 1 year, meaning clinical and endoscopic remission. Basically, we were able to block their progression, as measured by this composite index of new fistula, need for surgery and hospitalization. And this was highly significant as compared to those who were not able to achieve deep remission. So this is basically the first evidence, even though post-hoc data, of disease modification in Crohn's disease. We are able to change the natural history of Crohn's disease. But remember, those patients were very early patients. And my point is that early is the most important point. We need to treat these patients very early in their course. The surgeons have made amazing progress. And they have reduced the patient disability because of technical progress. Enhanced recovery protocol, single-site laparoscopy, natural orifice specimen extraction, ultimate bowel sparing surgery using what they call stricturoplasty. This is very important for patients' life, because when you have a young patient with this kind of belly after surgery, I think this is very nice for his life, and this is reducing his disability. But something which is worrying me is what is happening in US. And I must say, I don't know why. When you look at these studies that we recently published, looking at hospitalization rates for IBD across the world, as you can see in blue, for instance, here in Canada or in Scandinavia, the annual percentage, the percentage of hospitalization has declined. But it's not the case in US. And I don't know why. And we'll start soon a study here at Sinai trying to understand why so many patients are still hospitalized at Sinai, for instance, for IBD. This is something I've never seen in any other European center. There is something going on that we need to understand, and basically the rate of hospitalization continues to increase by over 2% in US. Something else is that even though the number of small bowel resection has decreased, the number of intestinal failure per 1,000 hospitalization has not decreased. What does that mean? That means that most likely patients got surgery too late or have not been treated early enough. And then if you are missing this window of opportunity where we can catch the disease very early, then it's very difficult to block the further progression of the disease. And I believe this is a reason why the number of intestinal failure has not decreased in US in the recent years. There are also some clinical situations which are desperate, and we need to make progress. During the last 40 years, I must say I've seen very small progresses in the treatment of some of the most debilitating situations in IBD. On the left-hand side, perianal Crohn's disease. This is such a burden for our young patients, and so far we have very few drugs working on that. We will start soon a protocol using fat stem cell to try to close the fistula, but the progresses have been very slow, and we need to work on that. On the right-hand side, there is another difficult situation, which is pouchitis. When you do surgery for patients with UC, you create this ileoanal pouch, and sometimes this pouch gets inflamed. And in some patients, this inflammation is becoming chronic. And in my experience, when you get this kind of chronic inflammation, we don't know basically what to do, and some patients have to go back to a definitive stoma. So this is a kind of no progress, maybe I'm too excessive, in 20 years clinical situation. And eventually, we didn't find the cure. I'm sorry, we didn't find the cure. This is the long-term outcome of a study that we did in France, which was called the STORY study. We took patients who were on combination treatment with Remicade, infliximab, and azathioprine. They were doing perfectly well after more than 3 years. They were in clinical remission, no need for steroids. And then we decided to stop the biologics. And as you can see, in the long term, almost 70% of patients had to restart a biologics. And almost 40% had a complication. Meaning that even if you take a patient who is doing very well, is in clinical remission, and also in many of those patients in deep remission, when the disease has started, if you stop the medication, the patient will relapse. So this is basically the proof that so far we have not been able to cure the disease. And let's ask to the patient, because this was my original questions. Did we change patient life? Very often I think we are concentrating too much on biomarker and so on. And actually, let's ask the patient what he thinks about our progresses. This is a study that I did when I was the president of ECHO. We did an online survey on almost 5,000 patients, and these were the responses. 20% of patients had to wait over 5 years for diagnosis. 64% needed emergency care before diagnosis. 53% were not able to discuss. And this is a big problem with our patients because of the pressure of time. Those patients with IBD, they need time. and we have more and more pressure because of financial constraints. And 21% have suffered discrimination. This is a more recent study, international survey on quality of care. And as you can see, basically 30% of patients with IBD say that their overall care was at best fair. So obviously it's not perfect. This is to me something that I don't understand and where we need to make progresses. This is very recent data that we did with the CCFA, looking at the delay between symptoms and diagnosis for IBD in the US. And this is desperating. Look, the delay more than 1 year between symptoms and diagnosis, 70% of Crohn's disease more than 1 year, 52% more than 2 years, less so in UC. And what was the reason? Uncertain or wrong diagnosis by the primary care, but sometimes the gastroenterologist was also not doing so well. So adjusting for age of diagnosis, ileal disease location, and biologic use, diagnostic delay of greater than 2 years was significantly associated with disease complications. So to me, this is the most urgent. We need to change that. It's not acceptable that it takes 2 years to make the diagnosis of Crohn's disease because, again, we'll miss this window of opportunity where we can change patients' life. There is also a strong impact on this disease on work disability. This is a survey from Norway showing basically that 30% of patients in their 40s were disabled because of Crohn's disease, less so in UC. So, second part of my talk, how can we do better? In the short term, this is what I believe. We need to fill the gap between patients who are everywhere in New York or in US and, for instance, our IBD center. This is, to me, the most important. Look at how patients are treated daily in US. This is a real-world treatment pathway for Crohn's disease published by Corey Siegel. And as you can see, this is how patients were treated with Crohn's disease at onset. More than 30% were treated with 5-ASA, which is not working in Crohn's disease. It's even not approved for Crohn's disease. And very few were treated with the biologics, less than 5%. And even with time, and this was after more than 5 years, very few patients were treated with biologics. So there is this gap. This is what we believe, what we are doing, for instance, in our IBD center, and what is done in the general practice. 63% of patients started on steroids were only managed with steroids. And some patients were on steroids for up to 10 cycles. This is not acceptable. And this is what patients believe in. When I arrived in New York, after a few months, I was thinking, wow, I am the only one who is not on a kind of diet in this country. You know, this is what patients believe. This is a carbohydrate-free diet. And we have many patients started on this diet, which is not working. I mean, there is no evidence that is working. And again, they are losing time, because as long as they are on their diet, they are losing weight, and the disease is progressing. We need to change that. So this is why, this is our answer. We have created, thanks to Bruce, Marla, and Laurie Kiefer, who have done an amazing job, we have created this IBD home, where we are offering a comprehensive care to our patients, including doctors, surgeons, dietitians, psychologists, social worker. This is a holistic care of IBD. This is fantastic. And actually, we have a lot of people, of doctors coming from abroad, even from Europe, to try to mimic our model, which I think is working and is great for our patients. Something that we need to develop, because very often patients are living too far, is monitoring with telemedicine. This is a study from the Netherlands, where patients were randomized to usual care, and care associated with telemedicine. And in the telemedicine group, there were significantly fewer outpatient visits and fewer hospital admissions. So we need to work on that. This is my conclusion, which may be a little bit pessimistic, but this is what I strongly believe. The most impactful improvement in patient outcome in the next 10 years will not come from biomedical research. They will come from changing human behavior, including doctors, patients, and something that I didn't know when I was in France, insurances. So how can we do better now in the midterm? We need to personalize, and as you know, personalization is big at Sinai. This is really one of our most important topics. This is a cartoon representing all patients that I will see tomorrow at my clinic. We have these green patients that will never progress, and this red patient was a kind of malignant disease. But when I see them for the first time, I don't know. How will they evolve? And I need to guess. Because if I'm doing step up in these green patients, it's fine. I shouldn't start this patient on very intensive because of the risk of medication. On the other hand, the red patients need to be started on top down to block the progression as early as possible. So how are we doing that? I must say that the best tool that is still available is your clinical nose. And this is a reality. We have seen so many patients with IBD now that you can guess just by seeing this patient. But of course, this is not very scientific. And there are a lot of work trying to develop predictive tools. For instance, there is this very nice study from UK looking at gene expression profile of CD8 T cells in the mucosa and in blood. And they were able to create a tool that is associated with the risk of progression of the disease. And this tool is now in clinical trials. There are many different tools ongoing, but still, I can tell you that tomorrow I will use my clinical nose because nothing is yet available. Then we need to personalize therapy. Everybody is talking about that. We have all those medications coming, anti-TNF, anti-integrin, a drug like ustekinumab, P19 antibody, P14 antibody, and so on. How can we choose? So there is a huge effort, especially at Sinai, to try to understand if we can predict the response of one patient to one drug and the non-response of the other patients. And this is where we need to go. It's personalization, stratifying patients with pathway-specific drugs, so that in this patient, we'll start with mechanism of action 1, and if he's losing response, we'll switch, and so on and so forth. This is not yet applicable, even though recent data, especially from Sinai, are very encouraging. Another way to go, I believe, is to combine biologics. I have shown you this gap, 60%. So one way maybe is to combine two different mechanisms of action. And the rheumatologists and dermatologists are already doing that, as shown here in green and in orange. They are combining biologics such as rituximab and anti-TNF, for instance. We are just starting to do that in IBD. And we have initiated at Sinai the first combination trial using adalimumab plus vedolizumab, two different mechanisms of action, to treat early Crohn's disease. This is a pilot study, and I hope I will have the results of this study next year. Maybe this is a way to go, even though the cost may be an issue in the long term. So far, there is no safety signal. Something which is striking as well is that I realize that many pharmaceutical companies are selling drugs, and they don't even know the mechanism of action. This is the best example. This is beautiful work by Saurabh Mehendru in the immunology department. The supposed mechanism of action of vedolizumab, which is an anti-integrin antibody, is to block the recruitment of T cells from the blood to the gut. And when we look at the literature, there is no data. And actually, Saurabh looked at that, and he found something which is amazing and which made the cover of this journal actually a few months ago. He found that this drug, vedolizumab, has a huge impact on payers' patches, which we still need to understand. It's shrinking the payers' patches, which is basically the port of entry for antigens in the gut. And we have a lot of very interesting ongoing studies about this mechanism of action. And in the long term, I believe that we need to solve mysteries. I am a clinician, and I have very often very nice exchanges with David Sakar about that. We published this paper with my friend Markus Neurath, who is a very famous scientist from Germany, in 2008. It was the 10 remaining mysteries of IBD. Very simple question. Appendicitis, protecting against UC, no explanation. Smoking, strong risk factor for Crohn's disease, no explanation, and so on and so forth. Very simple clinical observation. 11 years later, we have no answer, zero, nothing. I just want to show you something. Look at this. What is obvious? What is striking? I'm sure you see something which is striking. This is under our nose, and it has never been explained. This demarcation in UC, this is absolutely astonishing. And if we would be able to understand what is explaining this demarcation, very affected area, ulceration all over the place, and then suddenly nothing. Nobody is paying attention to that. And we have started a program to try and understand what is explaining this demarcation, because I believe we can find the cause of ulcerative colitis there. So how can we think about cure? We need to understand the mechanism of disease in an individual with many mechanisms and fix the problem. This is possible in very early onset IBD. It's like IBD-like, because these diseases are monogenic disorders, such as this one, which is caused by a mutation in the IL-10 receptor gene, with this very bad Crohn's disease-like features, with especially perianal disease, skin disease, and so on. And this patient was cured by allogenic bone marrow transplant. So it's possible to cure. And beyond this very early onset, it's very clear that monogenic disease with all these genes here can happen not only in very early onset, less than 6 years old, but also in older patients. And we need to think about that when the age at onset is young, familial disease, the disease is very severe, and perianal disease. Because this is possibility of cure, because these are monogenic diseases. But of course, most of IBD are not monogenic, and they are caused by these famous circles, genes, environment, immunity, microbiome. We need to think, I think, deeper. So far, all the treatments have concentrated on targeting the immune system. We are working a lot, especially at Sinai, on targeting the microbiome and the environment as well. And I'm happy to say that in the last issue of Gastroenterology, the first clinical trial showing efficacy of a diet, which is Crohn's disease exclusion diet, associated with partial enteral nutrition, has just been published. So, in the beginning I was saying too many patients are on unproven diet, but this can work as long as we are studying them as they should do. But we published an editorial with one of my fellows looking at all the recommended diets in IBD. And so far it's quite confusing. For instance, these are the different kind of diets, the CDD diet, the FIT diet, Mediterranean diet, carbohydrate-free diet. And look, in green, this is mandatory. You need to eat that every day. In brown, it's not allowed. And as a French guy, and I love French fries, I look at potatoes, and I was amazed. Potatoes are mandatory in some diets, but basically they are not allowed in some other diets. And the Belgians are worrying even more about that. So something else that also is a future, and I'm sure you know about that, this is just a general cartoon, we need is the era of system biology. We need to collect a lot of clinical data, biochemical, genetic, molecular, and to integrate into mathematical model. And we have experts at Sinai who are excellent in that for drug discovery and future precision IBD therapies. I'm not sure I will see that, but this is obviously the way to go. And finally, this is my credo. I don't believe so much in cure, but I believe more and more in prevention, like in other immune-mediated diseases. Indeed, this is where we are seeing our patients once the diagnosis has been made. But we know that in the mucosa of patients with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, something is happening many, many years before the first clinical symptom. And then if we can catch these events, maybe we can make a pre-diagnosis and then prevent. This is my dream. This is why I spend some time in this very nice place. It's -30. It's a DoD serum repository, which is a huge resource from the US Army, which is so well organized. I must say I love the US Army. They have now more than 62 million samples. And actually this is for you in the room, if you want to work with them, only 0.42% of their specimens have been used so far. So why is this amazing? Because all recruits in the US Army, they have sequential blood sampling. And of course, some of them will develop Crohn's disease, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and so on. So you can detect the early events preceding the onset of the disease. We have done this in a first study, and we found that these microbial markers, such as ASCA, that we discovered many years ago, are actually present in the blood of patients with Crohn's disease, as well as other antibodies, up to 5 years, and even 10 years before the first clinical symptom. And we are able to get this nice area under curve for prediction. And we look at some proteins as well using a somologic platform, and very interestingly, 11 proteins were also associated with prediction of Crohn's disease. So we are pursuing these efforts. We are refining this predictive tool, and I hope that we'll find something sensitive and specific enough to be able to predict and maybe to prevent. So this is my final slide, and this was a question I was asked. So my answer is yes, as long as we can see those patients. And I don't know, I think this is something we need to do. We need to bring patients to centers where they can receive the best care. Cure may not be achievable, this is my point of view, once the disease has occurred, and prevention may be the way to go. I would like to thank you and all my friends and colleagues from the IBD Center. I think we have now an amazing group of researchers, clinicians, and basic scientists, and we are making efforts to change patients' lives. Thank you.
Please. Thank you very much. I was thinking Dr. Krohn probably first presented his first paper in an auditorium not quite as elegant as this and not quite in the style of yours, but he would be, I'm sure, really proud. Now I have a question. The cause of Crohn's disease seems about as obscure now as it did 100 years ago. Age seems to be one lead because the disease occurs not often after the age of 50, apparently. Could you comment on the approach we're all taking here and anywhere else as to the cause of this disease?
Yeah, so this is where I'm very excited about looking at what is happening before the disease has started. Because as soon as the disease has started, if we are looking at samples, blood, biopsies, stool, and so on, it's difficult to sort out what is primary and what is secondary. What we found in the PREDICT study, and there are many other studies ongoing now, is that obviously there is something wrong in the handling of the microbiome by the immune system. And the pathways that we found, basically there is abnormal control of intestinal bacteria by the mucosal immune system with two different components. First, the microbiome is obviously abnormal. And maybe it's abnormal because of environmental exposure, because of diet. There is this concept of dysbiosis. And I believe this is preceding the onset of IBD. Second, the mucosal immune system is not controlling this microbiome in a proper way. There is a problem, for instance, in killing of some bad bacteria, the bad bugs, the inflammatory bacteria. So I suspect that this is the cause of Crohn's disease. And when you see that Crohn's disease is expanding all over the world, what has really changed in the world is not so much hygiene. I think it's mostly the food, environmental factors, you know. And I believe that the environmental factors, the food, has changed the microbiome towards something which is not well equilibrated. And maybe this is the way to go. Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that this is a reason for the disease. For ulcerative colitis, I must say, I didn't mention that, in the PREDICT study, the US Army study, we didn't find anything. We didn't find anything. No prediction. And it fits with our clinical practice. The disease can occur like that. One day you are perfect, and the day after you are in the ER with the first flare of ulcerative colitis. And I still don't know why. So I strongly suspect there are two different mechanisms here.
You raised a very critical question, Jean-Frederic, whether or not we are creating refractory patients because the second biologic doesn't work as well as the first, and then the third doesn't work as well as the second. But is it possible we're not creating them, but we're just selecting them? Because a patient who's not refractory to the first biologic, isn't going to have to go to a second or a third one. What's happening?
Yeah, I agree, David. So the point is that we need more data about that. For instance, the worst response to a second biologics has been mainly shown for patients who have been exposed to an anti-TNF first, and then to a second biologics of a different family. I don't know if it's true when you have been exposed to another family. For instance, I want to know if you have been exposed to something that an anti-integrin and you are failing, are you responding as well to an anti-TNF as a naive patient? We don't know. So maybe you are right, maybe there is something specific. Being exposed to an anti-TNF maybe is changing something in your mucosa, which is creating these refractory patients. I don't know, but the two hypotheses are possible.
So you highlighted very dramatic differences between Europe and the US, and wondering to what extent you think these differences are because we're starting biologics much later, or versus diet versus microbiome?
So, if I may, and with all the respect, I think there is something wrong with IBD care in this country. I want to be very honest with you for many reasons that we can discuss. Every day we have like up to 15 patients hospitalized for IBD. This is not seen in any big academic center in Europe, including the biggest center. So there is something wrong. And I want to understand why. Maybe I think there are many reasons. Some linked to patients, because they don't want to consult, they are afraid to consult, and so on. The delay between symptoms and diagnosis is awful. There are also financial reasons for that. I have seen in this country so many patients who were obliged to stop their treatment, for instance. because they were switching insurance and so on. This never occurred in Europe, for instance. And finally, I think the care is very fragmented. The difference in the quality of care, which is given in an academic center such Sinai, and what is done in the general practice is huge, is much bigger than in Europe. Maybe because of distance, maybe because of cost issues and so on, I don't know. But this is something that we need to work on. And I wanted to create networking, networking with gastroenterologists from New York so they can adapt the strategies that we have started to do and we are able to change patients' life. But so far we have not been successful. This is why I would like basically to bring all patients to Sinai. I strongly believe we as experts, and we are spending our life in that, we as experts will be able to see all patients with IBD within 2 weeks after their first symptoms. We will change the life of our patients with the drugs that we have now, not with other drugs. We have enough drugs. It's all about mismanagement. And I don't know very well, maybe you can help me if you have some ideas. I don't know how well to correct this.
So it's nice to have 62 million specimens that could be tested, but it may be a little impractical. It seems to me that whether the etiology is genetic or environmental, if you took the index patient in a given family and then brought in the family members for testing, that would be more practical and you could do more things than just what shows up in the serum.
I fully agree, and actually I didn't mention that, but we are doing a very nice study with the help of the Jewish Orthodox community doing exactly what you are mentioning. Because we have access to these amazing families with sometimes up to 5, 6 kids who are sick, and families up to 10 kids. And we are collecting samples from kids who are sick, kids who are not sick, and we are following them, and maybe we'll find more than what we can do with these resources from the DoD. I fully agree. The family study is key as well, and the Jewish Orthodox community, I think, is especially suitable for this kind of studies. And they are very keen to help us.
Let's thank Dr. Colombel for a great talk.